Thank you so much. Welcome to Don't At Me Hunting Twitter Bots at Scale. My name is Olave Nishe. Usually I'd be presenting on this material with my collaborator and colleague, Jordan Wright, who's helped me do a lot of this work. Unfortunately, Jordan is out on paternity leave, so you're stuck with me for the next 50-odd minutes or so. So Twitter and social networks are great in that they allow us to connect, share ideas, and build communities. Information security, like many of us connect over Twitter. One of the great things, again, you can have authentic conversation, but bots can change this conversation in both good and bad ways. So today I'm going to talk about how we can go about doing the end-to-end process of gathering a large data set and analyzing bots on Twitter's platform. So like I said, bots come in a variety of forms. There are accounts that do nothing but spread links, whether they're malicious or maybe just benign. Then we have accounts that don't generate any content. They maybe aim to artificially inflate the popularity of a user, or maybe artificially inflate the popularity of someone's content. Now, these accounts aren't malicious by themselves, but as a network, they can lead to some dishonesty on a social media platform. So I'll give a more detailed rundown of all the different types of bots and the ones that we looked into over the course of this presentation. But what I want to make sure everyone knows is that not all bots are bad. There are automated accounts that provide breaking news, geological information, and some that provide hilarious content or funny memes. Or we have an example that this is truly the future and we're living it. This study really didn't focus on the intention of the bot maintainer or the owner. We just wanted to lay the groundwork on how you can go about doing this type of study or this analysis on finding automation on Twitter's platform. Now, while I said that not all bots or automated accounts on Twitter's platform are malicious, some are. This screenshot shows a fake account that's trying to masquerade as the popular tech content generation TechCrunch. This bot was actually spreading a cryptocurrency scam that I'll talk about a little bit later. So as I mentioned before, having healthy discussions and building communities is what, again, social media platforms are made for. And malicious bots aim to change these interactions that we have on social media by interjecting themselves into conversations and maybe changing that discourse. One thing that's really important is to shout out the people who are doing great work in this space. There are a lot of other bot hunters out there, and these are just a few out. Of course, if I wanted to list all of them, this would be the entire presentation. But it's definitely important to give credit where credit's due. So we're firm believers that information security is filled with great and talented people who really like taking on challenging problems. And studying social networks is a very not only pertinent problem, but also a technically interesting one. So hopefully we can, in this talk, I can detail some of the research methods and get everyone interested in joining the bot hunt. One thing that's also important to note is that this is not the conclusion. There's so much more areas that can be explored. And we hope that we've laid the groundwork for people to jump off of that. So here's the main parts of this presentation. I'm talking about how you can go about gathering a large data set filled with tweets and user information. Then I'll talk about how you can go about analyzing at scale. And what's not on here is that there's more. I'll talk about how we went about finding, in our latest research, some other different types of accounts and bots on Twitter's platform. So let's get started. This analysis hinges on having a great data set. And in order to do that, the main way of doing that is through Twitter's API. And when we were doing and utilizing API, we had two goals. We wanted to play by the rules. So that means following Twitter's terms of service. So that means we only use one API key. We wanted this research to be reproducible by not only industry practitioners, but academics as well. And because we had to play by Twitter's terms of service, that means we need to be as efficient as possible in utilizing the rate limits to their full capabilities. So in gathering a data set, there's really two parts. You want to find accounts. So this is the user ID and other account metadata related to a Twitter account. And then we want to enrich that account with their tweets and their social network as much as we can. So the first part is finding accounts. So in order to find these accounts, we use the users lookup API endpoint. This API endpoint is very high throughput. So if you have 100 user IDs, you can send them up in one time and get full user objects back. And I'll explain what a full user object looks like in the next slide. And so This particular API endpoint allows you to make 900 of these, again, 100 user ID requests every 15 minutes. So this is what a user object looks like based on what you would see in like the Twitter web UI or on your phone. As you can see, we have like the counts of how many people are following my collaborator Jordan, the likes, the tweets. You also get things like when his account was created, his screen name, and his display name. So I mentioned that this particular API endpoint was very high throughput. And again, you can have 900 requests per 15-minute window. So we did the math, and this means you can do 8.6 million lookups per day. That's really great, but it presents a challenge and an opportunity. We have to be able to formulate or generate valid Twitter account IDs to take advantage of this API. So in order to do that, we did a little analysis and discovery on how Twitter has gone about generating account IDs over time. So in the beginning, Twitter started out with using 32-bit unsigned integers as an account ID. But the great thing is those account IDs were sequential. So you could work your way up the space starting with 0 throughout the entire 32-bit space. So in theory, we could have sent up 100 user IDs throughout that entire space. Unfortunately, that would have taken way too long. So we opted to do a 5% sample. So for every 100 user IDs throughout that space, we would send up just 5 of them. As you can see, the distribution of how many accounts were returned in that 5% varied throughout the space. This could be for a variety of reasons. Maybe those accounts no longer exist for those IDs. Maybe they were restricted. And there's a possibility that maybe Twitter just didn't use the entire space. So using this method, we were able to gather over 66 million accounts, or those 66 million user objects that I just showed you. Through the course of this collection of these user objects, we actually found that there was a 33-bit space. And this wasn't really documented in the literature review that we did. And we also found that accounts were actually created up until 2016 with this particular format. By looking through this space, trying to do a 5% sample again, we were able to find over 3 million accounts over the course of a month. But then things changed. Twitter moved to a different system in terms of how they went about generating account IDs. They moved to a system called Snowflake. And Snowflake is a cluster of workers that has one job. They're just trying to generate account IDs as quickly as possible. The thing is, Snowflake IDs are used for most, if not all, Twitter objects. So we're talking about tweets, potentially direct messages, and things of that sort. So this makes it a little bit hard to actually generate Snowflake IDs, but I'm going to break it down in the next few slides about how they are composed. So this is what a Snowflake ID would look like. We converted it to binary so we could break apart the constituent pieces and talk through those. The first 41 bits are the timestamp. And the thing about this timestamp is it uses a custom epoch. So it uses November 4th, 2010, which is different than what we mostly use, or used to the epochs that we're used to using. The next 10 bits are actually the worker number. So this is the machine in that cluster that was in charge of producing this ID. And the last 12 bits are associated with a sequence number. So for each particular ID that was generated on that machine at that time, it just works its way throughout that 12-bit space. So like I mentioned, it makes it really hard to guess these values because of these constituent pieces. And again, even if we're able to generate a valid Snowflake ID, there's no guarantee that that ID would actually be a user object. So that means we can't really generate IDs valid, in a valid manner at scale and to utilize a user's lookup API endpoint. So we took a different approach and let the users come to us. So the great thing is Twitter has a streaming API endpoint that publishes a random sample of public statuses. And the great thing about the results of that API endpoint is each tweet contains a full user object. So that allows us to get users in a different way. The API, the actual streaming API endpoint is really powerful in that it can be filtered for the tweets from a certain location, tweets that have certain hashtags and certain content. But the one thing that I want to stress here is by using this particular API, our data set is biased. It is going to skew towards people who are active on Twitter's platform, so we have to keep that in mind when doing any of the analysis associated with the data that we collect. So now that we have the users, it's important to enrich this data set as much as possible. So the first thing we normally think about is how can we add tweets? So there's a status user timeline API endpoint that unfortunately is a lot slower. You can only send 144,000 requests per day. So we're talking about an order of magnitude lower than that user's lookup API endpoint. So again, it means we have to be as efficient as possible with sending up or trying to gather tweets for a particular user. So we made some concessions in doing that. So instead of getting all of the tweets that were ever authored by a particular user, we decided to just get the last 200, and that's what's returned from that API endpoint. Also, we filtered for only English declared accounts, as well as accounts that had at least 10 tweets ever authored on their particular timeline. Again, so this does, we have some assumptions baked into this, and one of the reasons for this, especially the English declared accounts, was so that, we wanted to see how our classifier ended up doing in the long term on accounts that maybe we can analyze ourselves. After you have the tweets, one thing that's very useful is mapping someone's social network. This can be incredibly powerful and effective at trying to find larger networks of bots. But again, there's some unfortunate news. The API endpoint for getting the followers and people who are following a particular account is another 2 orders of magnitude lower. You can only send up 1,440 requests per day. So by comparison, this is what the rate limits of Twitter's API for the things that we were trying to utilize looks like. Again, there's some vast differences among the different parts or the things that we would use to enrich or find accounts. But in the end, we were really successful. We were able to gather over 88 million accounts. We were able to enrich fully 3.1 million of them, and that totaled into be 576 million tweets. And again, we found this over a course of a month, so not a really long time. So now that we have the data, let's talk about what bots may look like and some of the attributes that may help us find them. What we wanted to do was to not start with machine learning. That may be using a hammer when we don't have to. Let's think about how we could develop some heuristics, some cutoffs that may be effective. So we talked about the account attributes. So that's mostly the things associated with the user object that I talked about earlier. And we developed some simple things that we're trying to see that we thought were hallmarks of automation. We thought most accounts, maybe accounts that were automated, would have high entropy. So again, we may have random characters like the particular screen name associated with the bot that we found. This seems pretty normal because if an account or a bot maintainer or creator is trying to create accounts in mass, they would want a random string because that'd be the easiest thing to use. We also looked at the numbers at the beginning and the end of the screen name, or someone's screen name. If someone had 10 digits at the end of the screen name, it might be kind of weird. We maybe expect 2 to 4, maybe it's associated with the year they were born, or maybe the year they graduated from college or high school. We also looked at the ratios of followers to following. Again, most accounts that are genuine are going to have at least some ratio that's a little higher, especially those verified accounts. And we also looked at the general activity of a user, looking at how many tweets they've authored and liked relative to their account age. We also looked at the tweet content. We looked at number of hashtags in a tweet or the number of URLs in a tweet. That particular dimension was very confounding because we did find a lot of accounts that were just trying to spread spam. And so they were authoring tweets every couple of seconds, it seemed like. But we also found legitimate news organizations and content creators who were just trying to get their content out on Twitter's platform. So yes, they had every one of their tweets included a URL, but there was no way, in any terms, of being malicious. We also looked at the number of users mentioned in a tweet, as well as the percentage of tweets that included media. And last, we looked at tweet behavior. So there are some things that are associated with, now that we have the information about someone's tweets, we can infer things like the number of unique sources. So in each tweet object that's returned from the API, there's a source in there. And usually the source is Twitter for Mac, or Twitter for iOS, or Twitter for Android. And it would be normal for someone to have potentially 2 or 3 sources. But it would be very strange if someone had 5 to 7 to 10 sources, and maybe they're the only person in our data set to ever tweet from a particular source. That would be pretty strange. We also looked at a lot of things in relation to time. We believe that it's really hard to spoof time. And one of the things that we looked at was fast reply and retweet times. In terms of reply, it would be very difficult for someone to see a tweet, think of a response, type it in, and then actually hit send in around 5 seconds. That's really hard for most people to do. And so that actually was a great identifier and a way to build a heuristic to find some automated accounts. Well, it's true though, in some of these, in terms of the time to replies, there were some, I guess, cyborg accounts, those that are really associated with customer service. So there's an automated reply, but then the next tweet in that conversation is actually from a real user who's actually trying to help someone. We also looked at the distance between geolocation-enabled tweets, so trying to utilize the geotags associated with the tweet. That particular dimension was very sparse because not everyone allows their location on Twitter. And last, we looked at the distribution of tweet times. So bots usually exhibit some type of restlessness in terms of that they never sleep, unlike real humans. And so this is actually exemplified in the graph that you see behind me. There's a particular, this Songler bot is tweeting basically the same amount all throughout the day. But this seemingly genuine account that we inspected has about a 7 to 8 hour gap in which they never tweet. This makes sense to where it's maybe there's to work or there's sleep time. So again, these are some of the attributes that help us discriminate between bot accounts and genuine accounts. The issue is that some bots try to appear to be human. And so there's really 3 types of bots I'm going to talk about throughout this entire presentation. There's those spam bots that I've already mentioned, that try to generate content at a very high rate. We have fake followers. Their job is to really artificially inflate the popularity of a particular user. And then amplification bots, they're trying to basically do the same thing, but they're trying to artificially enhance or inflate the popularity of the content. So now that we talked about this, let's talk about how we can analyze these accounts at scale. Using one dimension is not foolproof, and it can lead to a lot of false positives. And so we turn to machine learning to try to classify these accounts at scale. So before we get into any more details, it's important to note that we use supervised machine learning, and that depends on having a data set to train your algorithm or model on. So this is just a breakdown of what that data set looks like. Fortunately, we were able to use a data set that was actually published by some USC researchers. So they, again, have done the labeling on these accounts, which made our job a lot easier. So they really have the first 2 lines or first 2 rows of this particular table. The last bit, the cryptocurrency giveaway bots, are the bots that we identified throughout this study. So this allowed us to bolster our training as we had more bots to identify. So in this portion, I'm going to talk about how we went about trying to do classification just using account features, and then as well as including tweet-related data, how our classifier actually improved. So what I want to kind of walk through is how the data science process of finding the best model. I know I'm going to gloss over some details because of the limited amount of time, but I think it's important to kind of understand the process that we went through in trying to do this classification. So most of the time, you start with a list of models or algorithms that you want to use in your process. We started with 5, but you could have chosen any of the many or hundreds of models that do classification. The next thing that you do is you want to split the data. You have to reserve some data for training, and then also trying to see how well your model generalizes on unseen data. And the last part is you really want to assess your model on a variety of metrics. You really don't want to just choose accuracy because your classes may be imbalanced or for many other reasons. So of the 5 models that we used, as I said, accuracy is not the best, but this is an easy illustration. The random forest model had a 98.43% accuracy. This was the best in terms of that dimension, but also had a great precision and recall that I'll actually talk about next. So that's the model that we actually went and did classification on our entire data set with. So as I said, the particular classifier had great metrics. It had a 99% precision and 97% recall. This is really great in terms of metrics that are used for classification. But what I want to make sure that I drive home is that classification is very difficult. And moreover, there are a lot of unknowns. So unfortunately, we do not know the true percentage of bots that are on Twitter's platform. And that makes some of the finer details of classification difficult. So calibration, and I'll break this down a little bit. So calibration means if you give a particular account a 75% chance of being a bot account. If you were to label 100 accounts with that 75% probability, you'd want 75% of them to actually be bots. That's really hard if you don't know the true percentage of bots that are on Twitter's platform. Last, unfortunately, in our training set, we don't have all the bots that have ever existed on Twitter's platform. We have basically 2 classes of bots, And so it's going to be really hard to generalize our results to the entire Twitter platform, or all of Twitter data out there, but we can make statements about what we saw in our data. Last, we don't really know, it's really hard for us to determine an optimal threshold, so we use the natural threshold of 0.5. So if our model returned a probability greater than 50% or 0.5, we label it account as a bot. But that true threshold would change, again, if we knew the true percentage of bots on Twitter's platform. So it's really important to kind of say those unknowns and the limitations of this study, because it's definitely, these methods aren't foolproof. So we did try to account for these unknowns in one way. So those same USC researchers estimated that the true percentage of bots on Twitter's platform are between 10 and 15%. So we varied our data set, our test set, to kind of match that. And as you can see, the precision actually fell. And that's because we had a lot of bots in our data set, and so when we tried to match the true percentage, it fell. Nevertheless, these are still good data, good outcomes for our particular classifier. So I know you're probably wondering, again, you told me all this lead up, how many bots did you actually find? Or how many accounts were classified as bots through your classifier? So just using the account attributes, we found that over 32% of accounts had a greater than 50% chance of being a bot. But when we make this more stringent, saying like we want to be very sure, using a 90% probability, we found that only 1% of accounts were bots. What we found is the distribution of scores was that there were a lot of accounts that were between 0.4 and 0.6. So just using the account attributes, our classifier wasn't able to greatly discriminate between the accounts in our unknown data set as bots or genuine accounts. But fortunately, we don't just have to use the account attributes. We can add the tweet data that we had available to us. So what we wanted to do was try to identify what were the best characteristics in order to do this classification. We had over 20 features, but at scale, if we were trying to do this continually, having fewer features is very beneficial. That means you have to store less data. That means your model is less complex, and it usually means that it takes less time for your model to actually train. So in order to find what we said, trying to find the 5 most important features, we use recursive feature elimination. There are many ways that you can do and whittle down the features in your data set, but this is the way that we did it. So we found that when combining the account attributes and the tweet data, these were the 5 most important features. We wanted to see, is this account a default profile? So is this an egg account that has no profile picture, no bio? We wanted to see when they tweet, what were the average number of users that were mentioned in tweets? We also wanted to see the average distinct hours tweeted. So that was kind of the distribution that I showed you on when they were tweeting throughout the day. We also wanted to see how many statuses are they favoriting, and also who are they replying to? So what we hypothesized with the average reply distance ID is there are some accounts that are only going to reply within 2 accounts that were created very close or in time to them, so their ID difference may be very small. So utilizing these 5 features, our classifier was even better. So we had about a 99.5% precision. So that's really good. So better than our classifier that was just utilizing account attributes. And here are the results on the unknown data set that we collected. We found that 21% of accounts were likely to be bots. And then again, 0.8 had that greater than 90% probability. Again, these metrics are different, but our classifier was more accurate. So we believe, if possible, that this is a better representation of how many bots are on Twitter's platform in relation to the data set that we have. But it's important to talk about, again, the limitations and challenges associated with doing classification. Context and perspective. Accounts really change over time. In the beginning of this presentation, I talked about how we only collected the last 200 tweets. So if an account was behaving like a bot in the previous 200 tweets before the ones we collected, then our classifier would mislabel this particular account. Also, like we mentioned earlier, the network data is powerful, but we couldn't have gathered the network data for all of those accounts because of the rate limits that Twitter has. Also, we don't have the insight into the cost of a false positive. So Twitter, they're actually trying to do this at scale. They have to think about the support costs, or maybe even the lost dollars associated with someone who's using their platform. So there's a lot of other things that Twitter has to think about that when we're doing this type of analysis, we don't. But what I want to say is that straightforward techniques did help us find bots, and we found a lot of them in our data set. But now that we've kind of found these bots that have a high probability of being automated accounts, or accounts that have a high probability of being automated, we can use that social network information to find maybe a larger botnet. And so that's what we're going to talk about next. So during the course of our research, we came across bots that were spreading a cryptocurrency giveaway scam. The premise of the scam was, if you send me 5 Ethereum, I'll send you back 10. I know that sounds foolproof, but the scammers actually took the money and ran. But we wanted to see how these bots were organized and how they operated as a whole. So we did some further investigation, and we found that there were some similar characteristics. All these accounts that were spreading this cryptocurrency scam were following what we've termed to be hub accounts. Again, we have no way of knowing if these accounts that are listed here were actually a part of the scam, but nevertheless, the cryptocurrency bots were following these particular accounts. So we crawled their network, and this is what we actually found. So in the bottom left, we call this like a hub and spoke kind of structure. The bottom left is actually the highly connected nodes are following those particular hub accounts, and so that's why it's made the structure, as you can see. But then we found a different structure, which was more mesh-like, where there were some bots that were just following each other. So that's why you see the structure, as you can see behind me. What we wanted to understand was, how were these two separate, seemingly separate structures connected? So we saw that there were some accounts that appeared to be amplified, and that there were accounts that were, their only job was to like these tweets. As you can see, there is this account, when we initially did this research in July, that was liking a lot of tweets, and it was all associated with this cryptocurrency giveaway scam. So our idea was, how about we crawl their social network and see how the interaction really works. So as you can see, these are the structures that I just talked about. On the left is the hub and spoke model, and on the right is actually the mesh-like structure. They were connected by the accounts that were in that mesh-like structure, liking the accounts from that were spreading the spam. So this was a little bit different in that not all of the accounts had the same job. Each one kind of played a different role. But throughout the research, we saw that this particular scam was evolving. So they started by just kind of masquerading as popular cryptocurrency accounts, but then they moved to legitimate news sources, Wired, CNN, and TechCrunch, to name a few. But then they started taking over verified accounts. And this is really detrimental because the blue check mark is a way of validating if this account is really credible, is in belonging to someone who's of note, whether they're a politician, an author, or an athlete. Again, we don't have any details on how they went about taking over these accounts, whether they were paid for or weaponized in some way, but we did see that when the rightful owners of these accounts got these accounts back, they said that their account had been hacked. What we've seen, and actually was talked about recently, was that these accounts actually tried to appear to be Elon Musk. And by having a verified account, again, even though they have a different screen name, a user who's actually scrolling through Twitter very quickly may mistakenly think that Elon Musk is actually trying to give me a lot of money. Recently, his account was potentially hacked or taken over, in which the cryptocurrency scam was being spread from his actual account. So what we found is that if you have a single bot, you can unravel, follow a thread and find potentially more bots. So in this original research, we shared our findings with Twitter, and I think it's actually important to read the statement that they gave us. Twitter is aware of the form of manipulation and is proactively implementing a number of detections to prevent these types of accounts from engaging with others in a deceptive manner. Spam and certain forms of automation are against Twitter's rules. Certain forms, excuse me, sorry. In many cases, spammy content is hidden on Twitter on the basis of automated detections. When spammy content is hidden on Twitter from areas like search and conversations, that may not affect its availability via the API. This means certain types of spam may be visible via Twitter's API, even if it's not visible on Twitter itself. Less than 5% of Twitter accounts are spam related. So we really appreciate the response from Twitter and the work that they've done since our original research. But what we want to talk about is what else we found, what else we've been up to since the original research that we did this summer. So the next two things, we talked about content generating bots and accounts, those ones that are spreading spam. But now we're going to talk about how fake followers operate, as well as amplification bots. So again, earlier in this presentation, I said that fake followers have one purpose, and that's to artificially enhance or inflate the popularity of a particular user by increasing the ratio of followers to follow. Traditionally, fake followers are actually hard to detect by just looking at an individual account. And the reason is because these accounts have very little to no activity. Again, they're not authoring tweets, they're usually not liking particular tweets. But that doesn't mean that they're actually an automated account. People use Twitter in a variety of ways. Someone could easily just use Twitter as an aggregation of like news or statuses from the people that they like to actually follow. But we think we can find fake followers if we use a particular assumption, and that is that they actually travel in packs or groups. From our knowledge, you can't buy fake followers individually. You have to buy maybe hundreds, if not thousands of them. And back in 2014, the New York Times did a great study, an article about how you can go about finding potential fake followers by comparing accounts one that you believe to be actually an account that has very few, if any, fake followers, to one that you believe does have fake followers. So in the graph that you see below, it's actually, my collaborator Jordan's followers, but you can see on the x-axis is the follower index. So this is the order in which someone started to follow Jordan. On the y-axis, you see the created date, so when that account was created. As you can see, there's kind of like a sporadic or random nature. So accounts that were created at different times are following Jordan in somewhat random order, which is what we would expect. Now, compare this to an account that we believe to have many fake followers. As you can see, there appears to be almost a straight line in terms of accounts that were all created at the same time that began to follow a user sequentially. That is very improbable and most likely associated with some type of fake followers. And again, the actual dot, you can it's a little difficult to see, is that account that we were talking about earlier. So we believe that this person actually has fake followers. One thing that's important to note is just because someone has fake followers, it doesn't mean they purchase them. We've seen that fake followers are being used as a form of intimidation for certain users. So again, we're not making any judgments about this person and how they went about acquiring it, but that we just believe that there's a pocket of almost 1,000 fake followers in terms of all of their followers that they have. So now that we've kind of identified how we can do this on a account by account basis, how can we find a large number of fake followers? So going back to kind of the Elon Musk example, at the end of our initial research, we saw that these accounts seem to have a lot of fake followers. They seem to be boosted. Again, this account is not following anyone, but has a decent amount of followers itself. What we noticed when examining these followers is that they all followed a particular pattern. And some of them don't look strange or peculiar. So as you can see, they have a first name and last name, which is normal. And even their screen name is a concatenation of their first and last name. But as you can see, all of them have a particular proverb or what may be an fortune cookie as their description. And this followed for particularly almost all of these accounts. So what we actually saw was that most of these proverbs were in a list that was out on GitHub. And this is really important because there are well-known lists of first and last names, but a bot maintainer wants their accounts to look as complete and normal as possible. So that means actually having a sensible and readable description. So that's why they would want to use a predetermined list to actually make their account seem normal. So to form or to actually find more bots, again, we took a similar approach to what we did earlier, was using a single bot. We did a 1-degree crawl of their network. And we pruned the result to actually only return, again, accounts that follow the first name, last name, screen name combination, as well as having a proverb in their description from the list that we got from GitHub. And this was the resulting graph. As you can see there in the green, I'll explain this particular graph first. So the green nodes are what we perceive to be legitimate accounts, and all of the other accounts, other dots on this particular graph are what we believe to be fake followers. So those black dots number in over 10,000, and again, that's from just crawling one account. as you can see, all of these black dots aren't following the green dots. And that could be for a variety of reasons. Maybe the bot maintainer just doesn't want all their bots to be taken down at one time. Potentially, if someone's paying for fake followers, they maybe only purchase a set number of them. But again, they're not operating in a way in which they're following each particular account. We actually did a crawl of a additional account and found 1,200 separate bots. But unfortunately, we couldn't crawl over all of the 3,000 bots that were on that fake Elon Musk account. Unfortunately, that would have taken 2 years and would have been ready for this presentation. So now that we've talked about fake followers, I'm going to introduce you to the last type of bots that we've kind of explored and did some analysis on. And these are amplification bots. And to reiterate, amplification bots are used to artificially inflate the content someone's producing. And that's usually by liking or retweeting a person's status. Retweets are important, and they're actually particularly powerful because they serve sometimes as an endorsement of the content someone is creating, but they also help spread content to other people's timelines. So it's really important to kind of understand how people usually go about using retweets. And so I'm going to explain the two numbers that you see on this graph behind me. So usually what you'll see on Twitter is that most tweets, especially those that have a lot of retweets, actually have more likes. So the ratio of retweets to like is usually less than 1, especially when you get over 50 retweets. So we wanted to actually put some numbers to that. And so in our data set of over 576 million tweets, we found that popular tweets, and we've deemed popular tweets with more than 50 retweets, the majority of them, or 80%, have, again, fewer retweets than likes. Also, we found that most people actually produce the content that's on their timeline. Only about 41% of a person's timeline is made up of tweets. So this is just on average. Again, we can't say this actually expands to all of Twitter's platform, but within our data set, that's what it looks like. The other thing that we found is that most people have a approximately chronological order of their timeline. Again, the tweets that they have are, even their retweets or actually originally produced content, are usually going to be in order. Now, again, for my partner Jordan's and even mine, there are some changes. So if you were trying to sort this particular timeline, you might have some inversions, maybe about 30 to 50 inversions for a normal account. But for a particular amplification bot, it's going to look a lot different just by looking at their retweets. Again, they're retweeting some particular content that is relatively old, considering the time in which they tweeted it. And so we use some of these assumptions to try to find other amplification bots. But I want to give an example and kind of walk through some of these things that we've kind of pointed out in a real life example. So again, by looking at this particular account, it doesn't look weird. It has a profile picture. There are a lot of numbers at the end of this person's screen name, but that may just be peculiar. They have no likes, and their account has been around for a little while, and they have no followers, but they are following people. But again, all of those attributes or characteristics aren't enough to say that this account's a bot, let alone an amplification bot. But we do get some signal when we look at the actual tweet that's actually in this. So as you can see, this tweet has 1,000 retweets, but 0 likes. That's very weird. It's not a behavior that you would see on, in terms of most popular tweets. And as you can see through this person's timeline, you see tweets that are amplified to different degrees. Again, we see one where we have 1,400, at least 1,400 retweets and 4 likes. Again, we're not making any judgments about the actual content that was retweeted by this user. Again, we don't know if that person purchased retweets or how they went about that. But again, this person's timeline is very weird. Of course, these are only 4 tweets, but actually all of the tweets on their timeline are retweets, and over 50% of them have this greater than ratio of retweets to likes.
So what is the expected behavior, or what is the expectation that these amplification bots would have when someone is creating an amplification bot? It is expected that a valid account should probably like that tweet, and then that gives an opportunity for the bot to start hooking up into valid accounts. So what's the purpose of an amplification?
Oh, so that one is to add credibility to the content that someone's producing. Usually a retweet means that people are endorsing this content or that content may be good. And so by seeing a retweet that has a lot of retweets, you may say like, oh, whatever source or content that's in there is believable or credible. So, but again, that's maybe just one reason why an amplification bot may be used. There are probably many others, but that's one that's really popular. Does that answer your question?
I got a question. Was any of the analysis for the content, like characters in the tweet, things that might be encoded?
So this is actually something that we just did last week, so we didn't do that in depth in terms of the actual content, but it's definitely something that could be followed up on to see, like, for a particular account, what are they actually amplifying, and so maybe we do that classification there. So that's definitely something that could be done in the future. So again, now that we've found one potential amplification bot, how can we find more? So our process of doing that was actually doing a recursive search. So we started with the seed account, and that was the account that I just showed. Our process was to get its timeline and filter for the actual tweets that on their timeline that were retweets, not original content. And then we had to find amplified tweets. So what we called amplified tweets were, again, tweets that had more than 50 retweets and over a 5-to-1 ratio. So again, they had 5 retweets to 1 like. From there, from those amplified tweets, we fetched the retweeter. So there's a retweeters API endpoint that allows you to get, per request, 100 retweeters from a particular tweet. And then again, we determined if retweets are amplified, and also the next slide has the criteria for which we did that. But from there, we can repeat this process for every retweeter we have. So it's really just an iterative process that can actually return a lot of potential amplification bots for us. So our criteria for actually labeling an account as an amplification bot was to see if more than 90% of their tweets on their timeline were retweets. I told you before that most people had about 41%, so we doubled that to be safe. And then again, we looked for if more than a third of their tweets were amplified, again, having more than that 5-to-1 ratio. And then lastly, we tried to order their timeline and see how many shuffles we'd had to do to actually produce a chronological timeline. And here's the result. This is a GIF that's showing how our recursive search evolved over time. In the green, we actually have what we believe to be amplified tweets, and the black dots are the edges and the nodes associated with what we believe to be potential amplification bots. By running this for just 24 hours, we found over 7,000 potential amplification bots, so we were pretty successful. And in theory, if we let this run for a longer time, we could find many more, maybe thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of bots, as long as they meet that particular criteria. So we think it's really important to share our methodology and findings with the community. So you can actually find all of this code that we use to find these bots, our criteria, our methodology on this GitHub, as well as we produced a 41-page paper back in the summertime that has an in-depth analysis and some of the more of the details around our methodology, as well as there was a blog post that was just released recently as well. But in summary, what I want you all to leave with is that you can really get a large data set full of tweets and users in a relatively short amount of time, and using that can help us inform our analysis, as well as you can take a practical data science approach, whether it uses machine learning or maybe some simple heuristics, and that can help you find a lot more automated accounts on Twitter's platform. And lastly, utilizing a particular account's connection can give you a better picture on what that account is really doing and maybe its purpose. So that's it. Again, you can find all this information on GitHub and actually duo.com's website. And if you want to follow me, you can @ me at JustSayo. So I know I have a little bit of time. Does anyone have any questions that maybe you can answer? Oh, I just want to back up. I'll make sure we get to you.
Oh, I just had a question. I wondered if, what about any kind of information that you could gather from the pictures, either the profile pictures or the tweeted pictures? So
I know that, I'm blanking on her name, but a researcher actually used TensorFlow to actually analyze the images to try to find, actually it was associated with a particular campaign. So I know that research has been done, so it's definitely possible, but it's not something that we looked into during our research. We'll start with
what tools did you guys mostly use? R, TensorFlow?
Okay, so our framework was there's a system, and if I had more time, I would have put the graphic in there, but mostly it's Python to gather the tweets. There's Tweepy, which is a publicly known module that allows you to get tweets and helps you obey the rate limits for Twitter and utilize them efficiently. to do the analysis, because we were working with such a large number of tweets and users, we actually use Spark. That's something that I'm very familiar with in my job. Particularly, the code that's on GitHub is in Scala, but Spark can be used in Python as well. But to do some of the modeling at a small scale, we actually used R. So there was a lot of different languages that were used throughout the process, but a lot of these things could be used within another language. So you can really pick your poison. But in our framework that we put up there is those two languages.
What is the rate limit like for Twitter in terms of how long it might take for scanning how many different things?
So it varies across, like, if we're trying to get user objects, tweets, and social network information. In the beginning of the presentation, we talked about, like, you could send up for user objects is 900 requests per 15 minutes. For tweets, in terms of an entire day, you can send up 144,000 requests. And then for social network information, you can only send up 1,440 requests. So it really depends. The Retweeters API endpoint has that same, I believe, 900 requests per minute. But Twitter has well-documented API information on there. So, and also that's some information in our report as well. So hopefully I didn't get any of the numbers wrong.
Do you have any plans to run some of those through things like Malteo, or depending on budget, some of the more expensive commercial food?
So that's really not on our roadmap for now. Of course, there are a lot of possibilities. One of the things that we were maybe interested in doing is trying to, again, nail down the intent of a particular bot. So there's been a little bit of research about trying to check the domain reputation associated with links that are tweeted by accounts. So that may be something that we explore later. But to answer your question, we haven't really thought about using some of the larger scale commercial techniques. The purpose of this research was to say, if you wanted to start today, could we set up a framework and kind of lower the barrier of entry to hunting bots on Twitter's platform? So that's reproducible and easy to start. So I'm going to go to him and then back to you. Go.
So what do you do specifically to do pretty graphs?
So Gephi is an open source graphing tool. So we actually have code up there that if you use kind of our system with the accounts and tweets that you get, we wrote like a script that outports. It's called GEXF is the output, and so you can just upload that to Gephi and to actually create some of these charts and graphs. Again, my collaborator might get mad at me because I'm calling it Gephi and not Jeffy. Go for it.
What kind of behavior in terms of, or what kind of results would you probably expect? Would you expect similar results if you use others, or did a similar research on other social media platforms like Facebook or other areas?
So I think, there's definitely been research about trying to find automated accounts on other social media platforms. It's a little bit more difficult because in Twitter, most information is publicly available, but in situations like maybe Facebook or LinkedIn, you would only get information about another user if you're actually friends with them or connected to them. So it may be a little bit more difficult. But again, there's been countless research on trying to find automation on various platforms, including even like customer review sites like Yelp and things of that sort.
Okay. What was Twitter's reaction? Are they collaborating with you?
So getting that response, and they were really receptive to like the results we got. And also they actually had they're really invested at one of the reports that they just released. So it's talking about their investment in actually having a healthy platform. And also they've been really good about releasing the datasets that they have. They actually just released a new dataset, I believe it was last week, and collaborating with researchers across the world in terms of trying to better identify bots. So definitely are encouraged by the efforts that they've taken to try to create a healthy platform. All right, if no more questions, thanks for coming.